Hello, fellow crafters, painters, sculptors, nerds. I just want to give a thank you to those who have stuck by me waiting for this video because I know it's been a bit. I do appreciate it. I hope everything's going well with you and yours. I hope you enjoy this video. I worked hard on it, pretty proud of it. I hope there's some things in here that can inspire you on your next project, inspire you to come up with a project you hadn't thought of before. And just overall, just hope you enjoy it. So enough of me flapping my gums. Let's get to the video. Welcome to WizKids Ogre. Our journey begins here in the Dungeons & Dragons Trials of Tempest board game. I chose this ogre because I love the iconic artwork this figure is based upon, and it is replicated so perfectly. Everything about this picture just screams what an ogre would look like, in most cases anyway. As with all creatures in high fantasy genres, there can and will be abnormalities, variations due to climate, crossbreeding, disease, magic, or all sorts of other variables. So with this in mind, I decided to enhance and hopefully not ruin this sculpt to represent a possible variation of an ogre. My first steps were removing his base, inserting pins to fit him to his base later, as well as being able to hold him with my vice handle that I like to use for these types of projects. To prep him before sculpting and priming, I used UV resin to fill any gaps and took care of any mold lines that were present. I found this random piece of wood quite a few years back when I was out in the woods hunting mushrooms, and I've been waiting for the right model to come along that would feel at home on this as a display base. I needed a bit of tweaking before it would work, which I did out in the garage where the mess is a little easier to clean up. And I sized down the ogre's base by using this GW base in its stead. When the display base was all leveled out on the bottom and I'd established how the model was going to fit, I primed the wood for painting. I used Nightmare Landscapes paints to give myself a dark base color to build from. I thinned it out with water to help it absorb into the dry wood, and I added PVA glue to help seal it up so I could get a more predictable result when painting. I gave it a nice healthy coat, making sure that I got the absorption that I wanted, and then set it aside to dry while I got back to work on Mr. Ogre's makeover. I used a combination of epoxy sculpt and milliput for sculpting the additions to our little ogre friend. When sculpting, I recently changed from using Vaseline or just water to keep my tools clean to using Nivea face cream. I picked up this little tidbit of knowledge from watching John Ninus, aka Ninjon, and it works wonderfully. When sculpting these features onto the model, I had a solid vision of what I wanted, the color of the skin tone, the color of these features, but I wasn't real clear on whether this was a naturally occurring trait of a specific lineage of ogre, or if this was some type of deformity or infection. Perhaps he'd consumed some troll meat and then became afflicted. I'm curious to hear your opinions on this matter. Is it a keratin buildup, or maybe a necrosis? Leave your ideas in the comments. And while you're at it, give me a like or a share with a friend who'd love to delve into the answer to this. And subscribe to be alerted when a new video lands. All of these things help my channel so much and are deeply appreciated. After sculpting a large portion of his gnarly skin condition, I began to add texture to the bumps and knobs protruding from his hide. When I was satisfied with the aesthetic I was going for, I continued to add this feature to more of his body. I'd originally thought of only doing his back and shoulders, but as I worked along, I envisioned it consuming and covering larger portions of his anatomy, and hopefully adding to his grotesque appearance. As I let that portion of the process cure, I returned to my focus to the display base. The scene is to be a cliff face within a small clearing of the forest where he lives. When tackling this portion of the project, I overbrushed, dry brushed, and used washes to establish my highlights and shadows. as well as drawing attention to the shapes and textures of the wood. I played back and forth with the tones to not only convey the look of stone, but I was also using tones that would be used in the ogre's skin to tie him and the background together to ensure they appeared to be within the same universe. I always find this manner of painting to be so relaxing and freeing to do. Stones are not just grays or browns and are wide open to interpretation. Environmental lighting, vegetation, moss, sedimentation all affect stone's appearance, as well as the vast array of minerals that they are composed of. So often when we're painting, we need to adhere to a certain expectation of colors, or we need to be clean, precise, and controlled. But this is far from that. I put on some Pink Floyd and just went with the flow. So many times during this process, I'd reach a point where the tones before me would work so well for other projects that I have in mind for the future that it was almost a shame to obliterate it for the pursuit of my final destination. With all of my different tones interwoven into the stone, it was time to grab some roots from the garden and add some vines clawing their way up the cliff face towards the sun. This part was meticulous and time-consuming, a sharp contrast to the paint job that I just finished doing. But this was going to add depth and realism to the piece, furthering the immersion of the viewer into the scene that I was creating. Piece by piece, branch by branch, or vine by vine, it slowly came together into a thick scaffolding clinging to the stone cliff face. I used paint and PVA glue watered down slightly to pull the vines further into the scene. I started with my lighter tones and then progressing into the darker tones for older or dead or dying vines and those in shadow. I used a pine cone to make my fungus growing within the vines. There are many types and they go by several names like pheasant back, elephant ear, or dryad saddles. I simply just rip the scales off of a pine cone, clean them up a tad bit, then apply a paint PVA mix to seal them up before gluing them to the diorama. While my mushrooms dry, I need to add some foliage to the vines, and for this I use some store-bought flocking. I know, but I do have some more wizardry tricks coming up. I mixed up a very dark, dirty green PVA paint water mix to adhere the flocking down, and as I did this, I established and reinforced my shadows as I applied the foliage. My next step was to apply my midtones and highlights. I wanted the light to be coming from the top and top right of the diorama. Perhaps an ancient tree had succumbed to old age and had fallen, opening up a window to the sun that could now reach down into the newly found clearing. With the mushrooms dry, they were now ready for their appearance. I gave the mushrooms primer coat a bit of a touch-up before moving on to applying the moss carpet that covers the forest floor. Another gritty mix of PVA glue, paint, and water. There are bits of flock tatters and dried paint tatters and other debris in this cup from reusing it so many times, and this is exactly what I want. The more irregularities and detritus in the mix, the better, to get that organic feel and appearance, adding some extra texture to the application. The moss itself is an old multi-use standby of mine, dryer sheets, torn into small tatters and laid and layered out haphazardly, covering any seams from the previous scrap applied. The mix easily penetrates this fibrous material, helps hold it down and together, and aids in blurring any hard edges with some stippling. The mushrooms were next to get their fair share of color added, using tones found already in the composition and ones that would be found later in the skin tone of the ogre, once again giving a cohesiveness to the diorama. And to further the variation in tones, I applied some washes to the mushrooms, And since I'm portraying a scene within a woodland clearing, we need a tree. Once again, a garden root is my source. I primed it and base colored it, then brought out the details with a little dry brushing, giving the backside of the tree a slight blue hue. Then came some applications of a few washes. After my washes had dried, it was time to apply some foliage. And then spruce it up a bit with some shadows, midtones, and highlights to make it feel at home in the diorama. To add a little extra detail to the scene, I decided to use paint and UV resin to make a small creek and waterfall. And of course, I added some wizardry grass, aka repurposed paintbrush hairs. And a bit of shrubbery using an old scouring pad. The technique is simple. Just rip off a chunk and start tearing at it. Tear it apart into small pieces, and the fibrous material quickly and easily replicates small bushes and shrubs. I then incorporated them into the background with some tones already found in the composition. Throughout the entire base build, the Ogre's club was kind of bugging me. I'd done the conversion by adding his tumors or growths, whatever they are, and I wanted to upgrade his weaponry somehow. And this WizKids Ogre just happened to be clutching the very thing I was looking for. So, off with his hands! They needed mild modification before adding them to the club. A snip snip here and a snip snip there, and the next thing you know, boom, he has a double-headed stone axe. After a black primer coat followed by a medium gray, I dry brushed on some titanium white for a nice zenithal base coat, and then I was on my way. You'll undoubtedly notice, as I'm dry brushing and bringing out the details, that I'd done a lot of extra sculpting to the model off camera. I felt that I'd displayed what and how I'd done these modifications well enough that I needn't bore you with more footage of the same steps. And here I am, applying the base coat. Noticeably, mostly out of frame, because I am, if anything, a professional. Yet another example of a consummate professional forgetting to zoom in the camera when you start filming. I tell you, this kid really gets on my last nerve. I applied a rather heavy coat of the speed paint, and then with a damp brush began removing the paint as I saw fit to reach the appearance that I desired. I wanted the skin to feel somewhat like Caucasian skin in tone, but with some foreign or unhealthy tones in it as well. So I began with a bright warm gray and added a touch of camel green. I thinned the paint to increase its transparency, and then I followed that with just a bright warm gray. The bright warm gray was also thinned to a near glazed consistency to take advantage of its transparency. Now I know you're probably thinking, this looks nothing like Caucasian skin, but my next thin glaze of yellow ochre and olive flesh will get us a little closer to our target. I'd introduce the slightest bit of camel green for unnatural hue. We have shadows of purple also for an unnatural appearance, and the bright warm gray and olive flesh both have yellows in them, so I'm dialing in on a Caucasian-ish skin tone, but because of the lack of red or orange, it is still slightly off, which is exactly the aim that I have as I layer up through these tones. To bring the aforementioned layers together into a more Caucasian appearance, I applied some glazes by thinning my transparent red by Pro-Acryl. Now admittedly, this is a lot more red or pinkish than the orangish color of a traditional Caucasian skin tone, but there is a method to my madness here. While I let the skin tone dry completely, I switched my focus to his quite noticeable and prolific case of dermatitis, starting with a layer of light umber and making sure not to totally obliterate the base coat of purple that I'd achieved already. I then began working my way up to a mid-tone by adding some yellow ochre into my light umber. Yellow ochre had already made an appearance in the skin tone and now is again being integrated back into my paint scheme. And as I continue my advancement towards a highlight color, I reintroduce bright warm gray into the mix, again combined with yellow ochre. With the progression from light umber to my highlight color using bright warm gray and yellow ochre, my overly pinkish tone to the skin becomes somewhat softer and now appears as more of a bruised Caucasian skin tone. To further this raw or infected bruised feel, I outline his crocodilian growths with transparent red. To move his skin tone even further from the pinkish purple, I glazed on some yellow ochre. Laying this over the reddish tone brings us into more of an orange now. So we end up with a Caucasianish skin tone, but still a little off and odd. So it appears humanoid but not quite human. When it came to his clothing, his loincloth and his wraps around his arms and feet, I didn't really want to go very flashy or flamboyant. I don't think ogres are concerned with the latest trends, or the finest of fabrics. Basic earthy tones that are most likely tattered, worn, soiled, and unwashed, I'm guessing would be the style of the day. As I started on his battle axe, I had a major decision to make. A simple stone axe would be cool, but he is surrounded by stone in the diorama. So how do I make the axe heads stand out and not become absorbed by the background and still be a convincing material that you'd see as a primitive weapon? My answer to this dilemma is obsidian. It would stand out, I could reflect environmental tones in it, and, in fact, it is a material used in primitive weapons. I began by sketching in my areas of brightest highlights. I knew that defining the convex and concave shapes were going to be key in portraying a convincing obsidian weapon. Much like NMM, there are areas of deep shadow right next to spots of bright highlights. Contrast is important, but definition is key. There is no contrast without definition. I also knew that this approach was to be done with a myriad of colors to be convincing. I couldn't just approach this with a scale of black to white. And so, Pro Acrylic Transparents were going to be the workhorse for this little side quest. After applying a couple coats of blue and a couple coats of purple, I came back in to reestablish my highlights, this time using ivory. Over the next few steps, I tinted the purple and the green with a small amount of black to increase the depth of my shadows, but not to lose those tones that I'd already established. I had saved my transparent black for the darkest of dark shadows, the ones that weren't reflecting any light at all, and for lines running parallel to my brightest highlights, to help them pop. And then as a final step, I went through and once again defined my highlights, the cutting edge of the axe, any area where there might be a glint of the sharp edge of the stone. It was a very back and forth method, not too different really from NMM. And here's our ogre in all of his rugged and handsome glory, based and ready for the gaming table, ready to spread murder and mayhem throughout all the lands that he surveys. And doesn't he look so handsome, nestled into his little fortress of solitude, where he can stash rotting corpses of unwary travelers and all those shiny things that they carry and wear. If you like this video, please let me know with a like and a comment, a share to a family or friends, and hit that free little subscribe button. All those easily accomplished tasks help me out tremendously on my little YouTube journey. Let me know what you'd like to see, or if you'd like to see me do another one of these forest type dioramas. Do you like these unique bases I've been making, or would you rather see something on a traditional display plinth? How about the miniatures? More board game type miniatures like Talisman or Zombicide, or more GW type stuff, 40K, Blood Bowl, or Warcry? Well, I'd say this one is a wrap. It was fun to do. Until I see you next time, make some magic happen. Sling some paint on some models and sculpt away. And as always, I'm Wes, and this is Wizardry.